Welcome, everyone. And this is our fourth presentation of the year, I believe. I'm Brent Taylor, convener of the speaker program. And on behalf of the committee, I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's Zoom event. Speaker tonight is Peter Mitchell, speaking about Under the Same Moon, an Australian battalion at war and a family at home. Now, a little bit about Peter. Peter qualified as a lawyer and worked in London for 5 years. Following this, while a partner for one of Australia's largest law firms, he moved to Singapore, where he lived for 20 years. Very soon after that, he left the law to run a regional non-profit organisation. His company ran professional training programs and he travelled extensively in Asia. He was inspired to write from listening to his father and friends as they regularly talked about their wartime experiences, and that seems to be an unusual a set of circumstances because my understanding is many of the fathers
Mm.
didn't.
Yep.
Following this, he's been to both the Thailand and Myanmar end of the Burma-Thailand railway a number of times. The Myanmar end of the railway is especially hard to get to, and he used his father's memoirs as a basis to explore and see the graves of many of his father's friends. While there, he spoke to many local people for whom the railway was a vivid memory. Some spoke of hearing howls in the jungle at night, and it must be not a very pleasant memory. Um, just a little bit about process before Peter begins, and for those that have heard it over and over again, sorry about that. He'll be answering the questions at the end of the presentation. You can ask your questions in one of two ways. You can post a chat message anytime up to and including question time and address the question to everybody. When the time comes, I'll read your question using whatever name appears on your computer identity, or you can wait and put your hand up during question time, and I'll invite you to ask your question verbally. And Peter's happy to have your cameras on, but remember everyone can also see you. Please make sure your microphones are switched off. And now you should be on speaker view, and I will invite Peter to speak. Over to
Thanks,
you, Peter.
thanks very much, Brent, and good evening, everyone. It's very nice to meet you all. One or two familiar faces there, and I'm delighted to be able to have the opportunity of talking about the book tonight, and very grateful to Brent and Jason for the invitation. I'll sort of just start off by briefly telling you about why I wrote the book and in the form that it's in, because it is a kind of an interesting genre. My parents died within a short time of each other just before we moved to Singapore, so a lot of the effects were sort of unseen, almost put away for safety. And I returned to Melbourne during the COVID period, and during the luxury of lockdown, I was able to start going through some of the things that I hadn't been able to look at before we left. And I started reading literally hundreds of letters written between 1939 and 1945. There were photos. My father was a keen photographer. Those letters were principally between my parents, but also my father's brother, my uncle, many of his mates in the battalion, in particular those from his first section at Puckapunyal after they joined up. There were it's about 20 hours of tape recordings that he made that I had moved over into MP3 format and listened to all of those. The telegrams, other documents of the time, and memoirs, principally my father's, but also memoirs of his some of his friends, all unpublished, and diaries kept at the time. When I was going through this, I thought this is when I go, probably all of this is going to be thrown out because it's very inaccessible. You know, it's dense reading letters, most of which are on very cramply written on airmail paper and very sort of thin paper and starting to decay a bit. And even the memoirs, who's going to read that? And so I thought, how can I make this, at least the essence of it, accessible to family? So this is not all lost, and that the broader family will see what happened at the time and understand a bit about the lives of my parents in particular, but the lives of people at that time in Australia. So I hit upon the idea of writing what my assessor and editor calls creative nonfiction, essentially sort of writing something which is fact, but in a kind of a sort of a fiction form. So the creative part of it is it's all fact, but the more intimate parts of the story necessarily come from the imagination. So that's broadly the dialogue, because I use dialogue, and there are also some situations where I build out. So, for example, at the end of hostilities in the Syrian campaign, there's a little Thanksgiving service that's held by my uncle Alan's company commander in a little church in a village high in the mountains of Lebanon. It rates about 2 or 3 lines in the sources, but I built that out imagining just what that service would have been like, because it was a very special moment for these people. So hence the editor's description of it as creative nonfiction. As I was moving through it, I thought, gosh, this is a compelling story. It really needs a broader audience. So I thought, well, I will kind of seek publication, and I thought in that form, being a sort of a creative nonfiction work, there is merit in it going out into the public in that form, because hopefully it'll be accessible or more accessible to a new generation of Australians who know next to nothing about that period of Australia's history. And I also thought, but this applies more so to the second book. What I wrote was so big that the publisher insisted that it be split into two. But there were so many events or instances of displays of stoicism and heroism on the part of ordinary everyday people, and not just the men in the battalion, but also the women and families at home, that I thought that these people should really get some recognition. So that was another incentive to try and have the work published. So that's why I wrote it. And I'll just share a screen with you now. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. So that's the cover. It's been described as a story within a story within a story, which is true. The essence of it is probably a love story, but it's much more than that. So it's the story of 2 brothers, Carl and Alan, who are very close, and they develop friendships in their neighbourhood, Middle Park. They develop more friendships at school. They join the Melbourne University Rifles after they leave school in 1932, and they make new friendships in the MUR from that period, from that time through to when they join up in 1940. And then in 1940, this circle around the 2 brothers, the neighbourhood friends, school friends, MUR mates, they all decided to join up when the 7th Division is being raised in May 1940. So if there's such a thing as a band of brothers, there couldn't be one that's more appropriate than this, I don't think. There's quite a comical passage in the book about when they go along to the Melbourne Town Hall to join up. Like all units, people from all walks of life and shapes and sizes um, enlisted during that period. Um, one group was almost, I think, the entire team of the Carlton Imperial Rovers Football Club. And all these people, thanks to some pulling of strings by their old RSM in the MUR, they all found their way into the same company of the same pioneer battalion. And they all were then moved off to Puckapunyal for training. It's also obviously a military history, and chiefly because of all the letters that are reproduced in part throughout the book. It's also a social history, particularly the letters that one of the main protagonists, Jean, writes of life at home when the boys go off to overseas. So these are two of the main protagonists. The two on the left, Cal, looking dapper, and Jean, his then fiancée, just before the outbreak of war. This is Cal and his brother Alan in their MUR uniforms at Flinders Street Station in November 1939, about to head down to a 3-month camp at Mount Martha. As I say, they responded to the government's efforts to raise a couple of extra divisions for fighting overseas. They moved to Puckapunyal. Shortly after they arrived, Cal and a few others were then sent off to Liverpool to the officers' training school. And this is a picture of Cal, second on the left, in a mortar school. Then back to Puckapunyal. Cal and Jean are married in September 1940. Then in December 1940, they go on what was then a very famous march from Puckapunyal to Shepparton and back again. And this is a picture of elements of the Pioneer Battalion being led by the 2IC Major Joe Lang. The battalion stayed at Puckapunyal for pretty much the entirety after enlistment, the entirety of the remainder of 1940. And they were getting very irritated and despondent because other units were being shipped out, but they stayed at Puckapunyal and were derisively called the Pucka caretakers. Perhaps for a change of scenery, they were moved to Balcombe at the beginning of 1941. And then in March came the order to ship out. They didn't know, but they were heading off to the Middle East. And this is a picture of C Company where all of the boys who joined up together found themselves. So what I want to cover briefly in the talk tonight is the Pioneer Battalion. Shortly after they arrived in Palestine and camped at Hill 95, found themselves part of a move into Syria to unseat the French government there. So I want to kick off by really, because I found it fascinating just researching this, and as would be implicit in Brent's comments, I meant to say at the outset, I'm not a professional historian. My career took me in another direction, but I've always loved history. I've read a lot of history, and I was very keen to understand more about the Syrian campaign than I knew when I started off on this project. So very briefly, the French influence in this part of the world stretched back centuries. As the Ottoman Empire was about to going to be consigned to history during the First World War, the British and the French decided to sort of carve up the area amongst themselves. And this is largely reflected as part of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. And then in 1922, the League of Nations mandated Britain and France to essentially look after the new nations that had been created out of the rubble of the Ottoman Empire. New boundaries were created, new names, one of which was Mesopotamia, which became Iraq, and the British were given the mandate to look after Iraq, which was a monarchy. These mandates were to essentially husband these nations into full independence. It was felt that though it was too early for them to be given complete independence, and Britain and France were sort of given, if you like, custody of these new areas to the west of Iraq, between Iraq and the Mediterranean Sea, was the Levant, and the northern part of the Levant was mandated to France, which split that area into Syria and Lebanon, and Britain was mandated the Palestine, which they ran controlled directly because of their obligations under the Balfour Declaration. The French felt that the British had effectively become the dominant force in the region, despite this apparent equal sharing of the spoils. And the French were quite peeved with this because this was their area of influence over centuries. And then came the defeat of France in June 1940 and the armistice terms, and the southern part of France, as we all know, was left to the French. The northern part of France and the Atlantic ports was occupied directly by the Germans. And the terms of the armistice extended to French possessions and French forces wherever they were deployed. So they were all to maintain neutrality. Although the French were officially neutral, there are a number of reasons why they sympathised more with the Germans and were antagonistic to Britain. And I won't go into those reasons here, but they include the sort of the long antagonism between the two countries. Pétain, the French Prime Minister, who became Prime Minister, I think, a week before the surrender, was very antagonistic towards Britain, as were many of his officials. They all thought that Germany was going to win anyway. And there was a strong strain of anti-Semitism and anti-communism in all levels of French society, which saw them gravitate towards Germany for that reason as well. Anyway, a number of reasons for that. So after the armistice, officials in Syria and Lebanon who were suspected of pro-British sympathies were purged, and in November, General Henri Dentz was appointed as the commander of the Vichy, Lebanon and Syria. And I should just say one other reason, very immediate reason why the French were antagonistic to Britain was that Britain had, because of their concerns about the French fleet going over to the Germans, had given the French admiral an ultimatum which he didn't accept, and so there was an attack on French ships in a port in Algeria, Mers el Kabir, and 1,300 French sailors were killed. It was, I think, in July 1940. The British were concerned not just about the French Navy, but about French possessions, that they shouldn't fall into the hands of the Germans, and Syria in particular, because if Syria fell on the Germans, it would expose Suez, Turkey, and Cyprus. And there was also the fact of the oil pipelines, which ran from Persia through Iraq, and as you will see there, through to Tripoli and Haifa. So there was a heightened concern about ensuring that Syria remained at least neutral, if not pro-British. And then came a revolt in Iraq in April, early May, where an Arab nationalist hater of the British, Rashid Ali, became Prime Minister. The revolt was put down pretty quickly, but the British discovered that General Dentz had actually been ordered to give the Germans and the Italians use of their airspace in providing some support for the Iraq nationalists, although not, as we The British were not to know this, but there was not much support provided. Um, the British became more and more concerned about an airborne attack. They asked General Dent's, what would you do if the Germans did invade Syria? And he said, well, he would resist them, but that was all subject to orders that he might get from his government, which didn't give the British a great deal of comfort. General Wavell was the Allied commander in chief, and he was having a difficult time of it. Firstly, he was down to about half his number of divisions because of uh, the actions in North Africa and Greece, and he was also suffering a number of political complications, largely because of de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French, and his deputy in the Levant, Catroux. De Gaulle and Catroux were very dismissive of the Vichy French in Syria, and they were anxious to take control of it. And they had the ear of Churchill. So Wavell was under a lot of pressure to do something about Syria. Wavell was concerned that he just didn't have the men, and he was stretched because of the other fronts. But the de Gaullist view was that the Vichy government was corrupt, badly paid. The people in Syria hated them. They couldn't wait if the Allies moved into Syria, the people would throw flowers at them, as de Gaulle said, because they just hated life under the Vichy French. It was also said by the de Gaullists that the Vichy army needed just the slightest pretext to just throw down their weapons and step over to the Allied cause. So Wavell finally, in fact, so I should say as well that as part of this, de Gaulle and Catroux proposed a couple of very harebrained schemes for Free French forces alone to move into Syria and kick the Vichy forces out. Both would have ended in disaster, with the Free French forces being underbaked and being about 1/5 the size of the very well-trained Vichy forces. Eventually, Wavell relented, bowed to pressure, and on the 20th of May, the day that Crete was attacked, he instructed his generals to prepare a plan for moving into Syria. And a week later, after Crete had fallen, this plan was approved, and it entailed a three-pronged move from the south, from Palestine into Syria. On the right, a move towards Damascus, then in the central mountainous region, up through Metula to as far as Riyadh, and then a coastal thrust as well up to Beirut, with the intention of securing the road between Damascus and Beirut. Wavell continued to be concerned that his force was not strong enough. He didn't have any armour. The French had plenty of tanks. He had less men, and the terrain, particularly along the coastal route and the central route to Riyadh, was very much in favour of the defender. That central route was very reminiscent of the terrain in Afghanistan. So, and General Blamey described the venture as being, in his words, largely a gamble. My book then proceeds with an account of the Syrian campaign from a very personal perspective, and I won't go into it in detail here, but it's based on Alan's letters, the letters of Carl's mates, as I say, in his original section at Puckapunyal, some private memoirs, a diary at the time, the battalion history, and of course archives from the War Memorial at National Archives, and Gavin Long's book, Crete and Syria. Just in closing this section, this whole campaign was predicated or premised on the getting into Syria first before the Germans did. Would the Germans have gone into Syria? I think the answer is no. Um, Hitler's general position in relation to the French possessions was that to not give the British any pretext for taking those possessions, to leave them in the hands of the Vichy French forces and for German forces not to go near them. That was it. That was the general policy. But then this campaign started in early June 1941, and uh, the British were not to know this, but of course, Operation Barbarossa was just around the corner, and Syria was just not on Germany's radar at that stage. The the campaign was not the cakewalk that de Gaulle and Catroux had been telling Wavell, for reasons of enmity that I've mentioned earlier with regard to the Vichy French attitude towards the British, but also their enmity towards the Free French. They regarded de Gaulle as a traitor, and that Pétain was the legitimate leader of the French government. It was a very bitterly fought campaign over 6 weeks. The Pioneer Battalion, just go back to the map, their first task in crossing from Palestine into Lebanon through Metula, you'll see there towards the bottom of the map, was to take the fort at Merjayoun. They needed to take that to be able to advance further along the mountains and valleys towards Rayak. And this was the first action that these boys and young men had seen. The Pioneer Battalion was selected to lead the charge on the fort on the first day. They were underarmed, they didn't have any tanks, and they were charging the fort with their hand guns on across this kind of open terrain, and the fort was very well defended. A company led the charge. They suffered terrible casualties, and in fact, I think most of the old team of the Carlton Imperial Rovers were part of that, and most of them didn't survive that day. After securing Fort Merjayoun, they then had to move further up towards Rayak, and it was a succession of bombarding enemy encampments in these mountain villages in Lebanon, and then climbing up these step terraces to secure the villages one after another. So, as I say, it was a brutal 6-week campaign. There was a lot of censorship about this campaign. The British brought in a political as well as a military censor. The Free French were very concerned that the public in Britain and America should not know that French were actually fighting against the Allies. And so Wavell's HQ were instructed to remove all references to fighting from dispatches coming out of this area. General Laverack, the Australian commander, was very concerned about the impact of the morale on his men, and Australian troops were quite bitter about the fact that there was so little reporting both then and subsequently about this campaign. A campaign medal was not struck. It was not part of the Africa Star for the official reason that the campaign hadn't gone on for long enough. It was too short a campaign for a medal to be struck, notwithstanding that 1,600 Australians were killed and wounded over the 6 weeks. This situation was finally rectified by Paul Keating in 1995. So I'll now quickly mention Japan as the moving out of these troops after the Syrian campaign back to the Far East. Japan entered the war, of course, in December, and in January there was some sort of panic discussions taking place when it was sort of finally recognised that the defences in the Far East needed to be substantially bolstered, with multiple divisions required across various parts of Southeast Asia. So it was decided that 2 divisions of 1 corps, being the 6th and 7th, the Pioneer Battalion being in the 7th Division, plus the Corps HQ, should be pulled back from the Middle East. This decision was taken in January 1942. Given there were about 60,000 troops and their equipment involved, and with the demand on shipping, this movement really couldn't get properly underway until February. And the destination, although the troops didn't know it, was the Netherlands East Indies. In late January 1942, General Laverack flew into Sumatra and went on a tour of Sumatra and Java to make his own assessment of the chances of successfully defending the Netherlands East Indies. He didn't like what he saw, and then 2 weeks later, just as Singapore was about to fall, he sent an appreciation to the Chief of General Staff in Australia, General Sturdy, to say that he thought that the Dutch troops just weren't, well, as he put it, very stout, that they were badly led. Most of them were natives and poorly trained, and they'd be no match for the Japanese, and there was little air cover. And if the Japanese took Sumatra, there was no way that Java could be defended. He sent that to Sturdy. Sturdy, at the same time, was writing an appreciation of his own on the future deployment of the AIF forces more broadly, and he had similar views and thought that all of the Australian forces in the Middle East should be diverted from the original destination of the Netherlands East Indies back to Australia. They sent these appreciations to the Prime Minister, Curtin, who agreed. By this time, Singapore had fallen, and while General Wavell and Roosevelt and Churchill agreed that the Australian convoys should not be sent to the Netherlands East Indies, they departed from Curtin and the Australian view in that they thought they should be sent to Burma. Curtin started to become an irritant because he was insisting to Churchill that the troops not be sent to Burma, but be sent back to Australia as Australia's security was under threat. So I'll just read you a couple of these cablegrams between Curtin and Churchill, because Churchill was becoming more and more angry with Curtin and was throwing more and more pleas, threats, warnings, and reproaches Curtin's way. So in one of these, he says to Curtin, this is on the 20th of February, "I suppose you realise that your leading division, the head of which is sailing south of Colombo to the Netherlands East Indies at this moment in our scanty British and American shipping, is the only force that can reach Rangoon in time to prevent its loss and the severance of communications with China. It can begin to disembark at Rangoon in a week. There is nothing else in the world that can fill the gap. Your greatest support in this hour of peril must be drawn from the United States. They alone can bring into Australia the necessary troops and air forces, and they appear ready to do so. As you know, the President attaches supreme importance to keeping open the connection with China, without which his bombing offensive against Japan cannot be started, and also most grievous results may follow in Asia if China is cut off from all help. I'm quite sure that if you refuse to allow your troops to go to Burma, and if in consequence the above evils affecting the whole course of the war follow, a very grave effect will be produced upon the President and the Washington Circle, on whom you are so largely dependent." So there are other cables, and I've actually posted a number on my website, and I'll mention that this at the end of my presentation. In the interest of time, I won't read any more out, but Darwin was bombed. Curtin became more alarmed. He sent more cablegrams to Churchill insisting that the troops convoys be diverted to Australia. And then, without telling Curtin, Churchill ordered the diversion of the convoys to Rangoon, and then told Curtin after the event. And here is Churchill's cablegram. Curtin obviously was incensed. The Australian High Commissioner, Bruce, cabled Curtin to say that he was appalled, and it was arrogant and duplicitous on the part of Churchill to have done what he'd done. But he urged restraint on Curtin because Stafford Cripps told Bruce that many in the cabinet felt that Churchill was at the end of his tether, that there were too many things going wrong in the war, and he just about had it. So to show some restraint. Anyway, Curtin kept at it. He sent some of these cablegrams are very, very undiplomatic, I have to say. But in the end, Churchill sent a very disgruntled telegram to Curtin telling him that the ships had been turned around and they would be sent to Australia. And I think I'm right in saying that this was so Curtin had won, and I think this was Australia's first experience of being an ally in its own independent right and having to assert its own position against other countries such as Great Britain and the United States. Now, there was one ship in these convoys, which was the first out of the blocks, I think, in Suez, which had sailed way ahead of the rest of the convoy. And this ship was called the Orchides, and it had on board the Pioneer Battalion. Lieutenant Colonel, as he then was, Blackburn's Machine Gun Battalion, Weary Dunlop's Casualty Clearing Station, and some other troops, about 3,000 in all. The Orchides was a fast passenger liner, and by the time it reached the west coast of Sumatra, the next ship in the convoy hadn't even reached Colombo. So I'll get onto that more in a moment. I just want to, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but the preparations for defence in the Far East, I have to say, were the delusion I find was sort of quite extraordinary. There was a conference held in Singapore in October 1940 for about over 10 days to discuss the state of defences in the Far East if Japan entered the conflict. And it was a very alarming report that was issued at the end of the conference that in all areas, air, land and sea, defences were woefully deficient. Churchill dismissed this on the grounds that Japan was even less likely to enter the war than it had been a few months ago at the time of the fall of France. A Boer War veteran, Brooke Popham, was appointed to command the air and land forces in the Far East a month later in November 1940. And his views were kind of shared quite broadly. He said, amongst other things, that the Japanese planes were not efficient, that Japanese fighters weren't as good as the Allied Brewster Buffaloes, that the training of British and American pilots was more thorough and sounder, and that the Japanese were not air-minded, that against a determined enemy they wouldn't stand up. So the Brewster Buffalo by the time of Pearl Harbor was pretty much obsolete, and it is they were called flying coffins. The Prime Minister of the in early 1941, Menzies, spent about 3 months in Britain and came back and reported to his cabinet and was aghast again at the hubris and complacency of the Chiefs of General Staff and the British cabinet sharing similar views to Brooke Popham. For example, that the Buffaloes were eminently satisfactory, that the Japanese aircraft were obsolete, and there was no reason to believe that standards in the Japanese forces was any better than the Italians, and so it went on. Um, and then, of course, the Japanese entered the war in December and proved that they were not the pushovers, and that the Allies should have realised that they'd been underestimated. But to me, the delusion seems to have continued. So, on the Orkneys, the the troops are given lectures on fighting the Japanese, on jungle warfare, and this is just a couple of excerpts taken from the voyage diary that the Japanese had poor eyesight, could not see at night, had poor weapons, and could not hit anything at 200 yards. In the troopship news, a copy of which I have, the statement is made that we are better armed and more intelligent. I now just want to say something very quickly about leadership. In the book, but more so in the second book, there's quite a lot about leadership, both good and bad. I mentioned that the Orkneys reached Sumatra way ahead of the rest of the convoys. It anchored at Oosthaven down in the southern tip of Sumatra here, and at anchor a seaplane came into view, landed. A very senior officer was transported across to the ship, and he met with Lieutenant Colonel Blackburn, who was a senior officer on board, was OC Ships. The officer concerned was Brigadier Steele, the senior Australian officer on Sumatra. Steele said to Blackburn that he had orders from Wavell as of a few days ago that as these ships arrived, the men were to be disgorged and form a force to defend Sumatra. Since that order, Steele said, the Japanese have now invaded Sumatra in the north. They've taken Palembang, which you can see on the map. They've taken an airfield. They're about to take another one, and they've taken a refinery. Blackburn's orders to form the men on the ship into a force and take them north and take back the airfield, the refinery, and Palembang. Blackburn said to him, was he aware that the ship is not tactically loaded? When these ships were, when the men were sent out with their equipment from the Middle East on these convoys, they were loaded just as ships became available. So cargo ships took on equipment, transport ships men, and in the case of the Pioneer Battalion, all of their equipment, when they got the train from Palestine across to Suez, their equipment was on another train, was put on another train. So these convoys, as they left the Middle East, had the men's equipment had largely become separated, so that the Pioneer Battalion had what they were standing up in. They had rifles, they had a small amount of ammunition, and some kit, whatever they could carry. The Machine Gun Battalion had no machine guns and no ammunition. So none of these convoys would have been in a position to once landed, to get themselves formed to fight for probably 2 or 3 weeks. So Blackburn informed Steele that his men didn't have any ammunition and few weapons, and more so, where are the rest of the ships, because they're not in a state to fight. And Steele said, well, he can't get hold of Wavell. But nevertheless, he sees no reason to change the order. So the order stands. These men have to disembark and go ashore and take the fight to the Japanese. Blackburn calls his senior officers, tells them what the orders are. They're incredulous. He says, "Well, I'm not going to, I'm not going to deceive you. This is a suicide mission." He calls the ship's captain to ask him what's in the armory. There are some Martini Henry rifles, some American Ross and Springfield rifles that have the wrong caliber, wrong bore, so no, pretty much useless, and some First World War rifles, and that's it. So they then proceed to go ashore and take the fight to the Japanese. Brent, have I got time to read this out? So,
Yes.
thank you. So, I'm
That's right.
reading this from my book. So, in the early afternoon, the 2,500 men who formed Blackburn's makeshift brigade to go ashore assembled on deck. These were all the men on board who knew how to use a rifle. The force comprised the Pioneer Battalion and Blackburn's machine gun battalion without machine guns, together with elements of some other units. One look at their weaponry or lack of was enough to confirm Blackburn's assessment of their chances of surviving. The assembled men on deck had a variety of weaponry, ranging from the barely serviceable and effective to the downright primitive. It was a sorry and pathetic sight, and it was clear to all on board that these men were in no state to fight and that they had little chance of returning. The rifles taken from the ship's armoury were given to those soldiers who were best trained to use them. One had a Boer War rifle, another had a rifle and bayonet but no ammunition. Others had Great War rifles. Those without rifles carried pickaxe handles and clubs. They were told to walk closely behind a comrade with a rifle, and if the other fell, to pick up his rifle. Some carried cloth bags. Their plan was to fill them with gravel and swing them in hand-to-hand combat. Steele had told Blackburn there were few rations on land, and so the men were issued with all the dry rations they could find on the ship, only about 3 days' worth. One of the machine gunners stood on the deck, rifle slung, with an Australian football in the crook of his arm. Men around him nudged each other and smiled. "What the hell is that for?" asked one. "We won the premiership with it 2 years ago, mate. I'm not going to fucking leave it behind now." Which sounds rather implausible, but that's word for word in the voyage diary. It was now mid-afternoon and a small ship came alongside. It was called the Van Spilbergen, a dirty old Dutch oil tanker that could manage the shallow waters of Lampung Bay. Blackburn's men were very slowly disgorged. There was only one narrow gangway, and it was almost nightfall before all troops had transferred onto the smaller ship. The men looked so obviously unfit to fight, but nevertheless unhesitatingly stepped down the gangway. Several nurses and even 2 American journalists on the Orchidees openly wept. A man next to Cal said, "Cal, I would have loved to have seen my wife once more." I'll stop there in the interest of time, but and very quickly, I'll just finish up with the home front. I deal with this at some length in the book, but it's very hard, I think, for people these days to comprehend that there was just this absolute conviction in Australia at the time that the country was about to be invaded. Precautions had started take place in 1940 with parks and gardens around in towns and cities on the eastern side of Australia, at least being dug up. And then after Japan entered the war, buildings are sandbagged, windows were taken out, air raid shelters installed, home guards set up, signs taken down, street signs, railway station signs, just like in Britain. But people are absolutely convinced that invasion was imminent. There was a scorched earth policy. Farmers on the eastern side were told what to leave and what to destroy before they left their farms. Cattle were pulled back from northern Australia. So it's as I say, it's just very hard to comprehend. But I won't go to that detail now. I'll just finish on a more personal note. Cal and Jean, the 2 main protagonists, they'd been writing to each other right through to this point. But Cal's last letter would be sent from Colombo. There was no possibility of sending mail after that. The delivery of mail obviously was becoming more problematic. Mail planes are being shot down. Um, and Jean continued to write in January and February of 1942. She was writing to him, not realizing that every letter that she wrote from the beginning of January would not reach him. It would be returned with a big stamp, delivery impracticable, return to sender. So she continued to write right through January and to the end of February, thinking that he was still in the Middle East. She had no idea that he that they had well was in the Netherlands, East Indies by this stage. So here's a letter that she wrote, an extract in on the 26th of February when he's there in Oosthaven. She hasn't heard from him now for some time. I do wish they would send you home and that the war would finish. I do miss you terribly. I'm hoping I might get a letter this week. I haven't had one for a month now. It's an awfully long time. I do hope I get a letter soon. I live in hope every day that you might turn up unexpectedly. The only thing is, I should probably die with joy, and that wouldn't be much good, would it? All my love always, Jean. That's my website, and on it is a complete bibliography. As I said earlier, there are also extracts from many of the cables between Curtin and Churchill, and other information as well. So, thank you very much. I'm sorry if I've gone a bit over time.
That's all right. Thanks very much, Peter. You could probably turn your slide. Yes, you could probably turn your slideshow off now.
Yep.
Um, I'll now ask if there's any questions from the chat. I haven't seen whether there is or not. Hang on, I've got my. Oh, I've changed the. I've changed the chat. Does anyone put a question in? No. So, are there any questions? Raise your hand and ask away. Philip.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Peter. Peter, the book contains a lot of letters, as you've mentioned, between Carl and Jean in particular. With the second book, when they're going to be incarcerated in Thailand, presumably there's not so many letters going on. I'm just wondering how you got information about what was happening with them in when they were on the Burma Railway.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. One of my father's mates kept a diary,
Mhm.
uh, and the battalion commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Williams, also kept a diary.
Mm.
So I had access to those, and there's also Brigadier Varley's papers, which were available through the
Mhm.
Australian War Memorial and National Archives, and the battalion history also has a couple of chapters on that period as well, written by one of the men who's actually a trained journalist. Um, and my father's archive, my father's memoirs, um, and the memoirs of some of his friends as well. And interestingly, also, my father, he never spoke about, he was always speaking about other people, not about himself. And I went into the War Crimes Tribunal archives as well. And I found a couple of affidavits that he'd filed for the War Crimes Tribunal
Mhm.
hearings in Singapore about incidents in which he'd been involved that I didn't know about. So
Mhm.
that's how I put all that together, Philip.
All right. And then how do you cover the angle of Jean and what she was doing in Australia?
She was still writing, and
Okay. Well, she didn't stop in early 42 or whatever?
no, she just kept on writing, but they kept on telling them. Um, she joined a Pioneer Women's Auxiliary, which is a
Mm-hmm.
support
Yep.
group for the families,
Mm.
and and they were told, and his father was a great writer as well, Cal's
Mm.
father, and they were told just to keep on writing. She kind of lost impetus at one point, I think, because
Mm.
you said, well, what's the point? Because,
Yeah, 3 years, who
and
knows?
yeah, and then they were told, well, listen, don't write too much because it'll be too much for the Japanese to censor. So just write, capital letters, 3 or 4 lines. So they did that for a while, but they
Hmm.
never stopped.
Okay,
Yeah.
interesting. Oh, and
And
sorry, one last question. When's the second book or the second part coming out?
um, late this year, early next year, Philip,
Okay.
I hope. And just on those letters in the second book, just one thing I should mention, um, without spoiler alert, but the letters that are written immediately post-release are just like heartbreaking.
Mm.
Getting into writing again and coming to terms with writing about what happened.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah.
Mm. Have you seen the Peter Carey movie, the Long Walk North, or whatever it's called? I watched half it and couldn't stomach any more of it. So I don't know if you saw that. It
Not
seemed
yet.
to have some similar lines. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. No, not yet.
Mm.
It's the second book is I'd say it's quite different. Yeah,
Mhm. Yep.
for
Okay.
reasons that you've alluded to.
Mhm. Right.
Are there any other questions? Silence. Okay.
Look, I might ask one. I've just been musing on it, if I can.
Yes,
Um,
please.
yep, Peter, right at the very early part, you said that the Pioneer Battalion was used for the assault on, and forgive my pronunciation because I've written it down phonetically, Meridian.
Yeah, yeah, for
Yep.
Fort Murjoyan. Yes, yes,
Yes.
Graham.
Yes. Why was the Pioneer Battalion used? I would have thought that was an infantry action.
So they were the Pioneer Battalion was formed as a sort of on the basis of German pioneers. So combining both infantry and
Right.
engineers. So they were trained as infantry as well as engineers. The problem was, I mean, I don't know, and I haven't been able to find out why they were selected to lead that assault on the first day, because I think they were underbaked as trained infantry, and they certainly didn't have the weaponry.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay.
Anyone else? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Peter, um, for an excellent presentation, and we'll be sending out more information in a few days. There's some other bits of pieces of business for the audience, so feel free to leave. But I think you're a member, so you probably would be interested in hearing some of this. We've got some history happening, some more history. So the next presentation will be 1945, The Reckoning, on the 20th of August 2025, and explores the stories of the final year of the war, um, with great interest to Australians. Uh, he highlights what he calls the imperial muscle memory, where the British policy interferes with everything that we're trying to do. Um, there was decisions to reimpose French control of Indochina, use the Japanese prisoners of war in that bloody process, and then um, the famous Special Forces operation in Semut. We've heard a little bit about that before, so there's another take on that. So that's on the 20th of August, um, by Phil Craig. The second event is happening, in fact, on the 11th of October. Um, and that's another conference, a one-day conference, Fighting to the Finish, Australia in 1945. So we have, as usual, an esteemed group of presenters who will be exploring part of the Australians played in the closing chapters of the war and the impact that it has had on the 80 years that follows. So keynote will be delivered by Emeritus Professor David Horner, and he's always got some very interesting information. And another list of um, eminent presenters. At a loss for words. So that's on the 11th of October. So this brings our session to a close. Thanks to Peter. Thanks for Jason, who keeps things going even when he's got COVID. We hope you come again, and good night to you from the committee and myself. So good night.
Good night.